Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the challenging job of corralling people back when there's coffee, there are lolly bags. We've had an exciting, at times depressing, sometimes concerning discussion about existential risks associated with AI. And we move now to much more immediate questions, which is how AI is affecting the educational landscape, in particular universities. As I was saying to some people yesterday, when ChatGPT was released almost exactly 3 years ago, 3 years this weekend, academics around the world thought, wow, this realization of the potential of artificial intelligence, which has so long been overstated, this technology that can simulate human thought and reasoning, it could transform the world, and the greatest thing academics were worried about was that our students might cheat on their exams. And around the world, I think many academics went very quickly through the 5 stages of grief, of denial, anger, bargaining with God, hoping Turnitin.com could solve this for us, depression, and then very quickly, I think most of us reached the level of acceptance. So we had 5 stages of grief. We've now got 5 experts to help us solve these problems in the next 60 minutes or so. And so what we're going to be talking about is the way in which AI is transforming the way we learn in particular. And it's forcing universities to confront an existential challenge. Because a lot of the work we do, in particular in undergraduate training, presumes that our graduates will go on to careers where they move words and numbers around on a screen all day. What is the kind of modern version of knowledge work, the solving of non-routine problems using cognitive skills that are trainable at universities, but which we're discovering AI systems are increasingly good at. That challenge to the value proposition of a degree is coming at the same time as the legitimacy of universities as the bastions of expertise is being called into question, not just because of the rise of AI, but also larger political forces, which we're seeing at its most extreme perhaps in the United States. And so this panel is going to be touching on the twin questions of the enduring value and legitimacy of universities when AI appears to be coming for much of what we've been doing for centuries, and in some cases doing it more cheaply and more effectively, and that's posing a real challenge to what universities should be doing in the educational mission and to some extent the research mission, although we'll focus primarily on the educational mission. So we've got, as I said, 5 disparate panelists coming at this from different directions. Gregor Kennedy is Deputy Vice-Chancellor overseeing education here at the University of Melbourne. My colleague, Chieh, is Vice Dean Academic Affairs at NUS College, where I work, but he also chairs an AI policy panel at the National University of Singapore. Natasha Ziebell is a Senior Lecturer in the Faculty of Education here at Melbourne. Liz Johnson is an Emeritus Professor at Deakin University, and Jungpil Hahn leads AI governance with me at AI Singapore and has been thinking about future of work, future of the labour market. So, Gregor, can I set the scene with you? When ChatGPT was going around the world, Australian universities were caricatured as going back to paper and pen exams as part of the reaction. I don't think that was the case necessarily at Melbourne. You've argued that universities need to move beyond the early defensive responses to generative AI and start embedding it meaningfully into programs. But if AI can now perform many tasks that once defined knowledge work, how should universities rethink their core purpose of university education and what, in your view, remains distinctively human and non-automatable? So yeah, lead us off.
Just a small question to start off, Simon. Thank you. Welcome, panel. Welcome, everyone. So I think you're right. I think in your opening remarks, you're right. The assurance of learning was certainly one of the first things that universities in this country really started to grapple with, and very quickly, maybe 12 to 18 months, moved to thinking about more of the opportunities for the adoption of AI in curriculum. I think that they've done that because from a regulatory point of view, it was important to have some perspective on how we could assure the learning outcomes within our programs, given that's one of the primary things universities do. And then I think the embrace of AI in curriculum, for a number of reasons, how it has the potential to really enhance and support learning and teaching, and also recognising that in the future it will become an essential tool. I think that we're quite early in the cycle, the second part of your question, quite early in the cycle of how this is going to impact on work. I understand what you're saying in terms of knowledge work. I think there's quite a bit of rhetoric around that at the moment. I do feel that things will change and things will evolve in terms of the future of work and the way in which we embrace AI in knowledge work. But I don't know that that means that the fundamental tenets of the university go away. I think that what universities are about developing people and developing people who can think and critically think and analyse with expertise, something that you mentioned. I don't necessarily agree about the intelligence of AI and the expertise in the system. I think there's a different type of human expertise. I think universities will continue to be about building that expertise within the individual, their understanding of phenomenon, their understanding of systems, their understanding of the world as thinking individuals and their ability to apply that knowledge and expertise. And then I'm a bit old school. I think the value and the role of the university, which is fundamentally where the question was at the heart of, what is the role of a university, is about, when done well, the transformation of the individual. It's about somebody experiencing education in whatever form and coming out the other side a changed person with a different perspective on the world, and that's a really important role of universities.
Thanks. And I think that highlights one theme that we'll probably come back to, which is this larger question of the extent to which universities have this tension between transformative experience for individuals and preparing them for employment. And that sort of aspirational versus vocational role, I think, is a tension within universities. So, Lloyd, can I touch on you? What do you see as the risks here? Because one of the things, I think in Singapore, we went a little bit faster to the opportunities of AI, but I think we're also cognizant of some of the risks that AI, overuse of AI or over-reliance on AI can erode the cognitive muscles that universities are meant to develop. So, yeah, how worried are you about this, and what, if anything, should we do to hold back AI or just go all in on its opportunities?
So I'm an optimist, pessimist. I'm optimist about the long term. I'm really pessimistic about the short term. Mostly because I think we are still in a transitional phase. We don't understand enough. We haven't reached a new equilibrium, and that's causing a lot of anxiety, right? Just to give an example. So we hear all these stories about how students are using AI to submit fabricated codes, fake citations and stuff like that. And I've seen them myself. But they represent a very small sample of a lot of things that people do with AI. That's only the tip of the iceberg, right? So we have a very large study ongoing in NUS right now, where someone managed to get a very large grant, and we had lunch with him, right? For us to give free accounts to a lot of students on the condition that it basically allowed the researchers to download all the transcripts, anonymize, and study what students actually do with the AI. And I think we don't have enough of our data to really get sufficiently worried in the right way. But what we do see, at least anecdotally, is not pretty in many ways, but perhaps that's partly because as instructors, as lecturers, we tend to get excited when people, or we tend to get anxious when people don't do things as we want them to. Now, this idea that AI could, encourage a lot of students or give this temptation to a lot of students to cognitively offload, in some sense, it's not a completely new problem. Because if you think about it, if you're lucky enough to go to school surrounded by really, smart and impressionable friends who are willing to share their work with you, you are in a kind of a similar situation, except that the cost has gone down so much more. Now, in order for you to profit from an environment like that, you don't even need friends who you need to persuade, right? You just need to be, have access to internet access, and you're able to just talk to a chatbot. So that definitely causes a strain in the system, because human beings, as usual, students are human beings too, human nature is going to beckon. Sooner or later, the pressure of work is going to get to you. Sooner or later, laziness is going to get to you, and you'll be tempted to take what is actually delivered to you on the screen, right? Some years ago, I was involved in a study where we tried to understand what happens to students where you allow them to talk to each other when they do certain quizzes, and then you compare that to a final quiz where they are no longer allowed to talk to each other. And one obvious discovery would be, as you might imagine, all the ones who were able to discuss the quizzes all scored higher in the quizzes. Duh, pretty obvious, right? But not all the ones who scored higher in the quizzes because they discussed scored well for the final quiz. We discovered that among the discussants, There are different kinds of discussions. There are those who go in because they're hoping to get an answer from people. And there are those who go in independent-minded. We call them the disagreeable ones. In fact, they are the ones who end up scoring better in the final quiz. And that tells us a lot about what we can, I kind of expect from the way students use AI. If they use them as, in a sense, independent-minded agents who are trying to get something out of it, of their own, and internalize it, I think they'll be fine. But this is no different from students being able to learn from other students, being able to learn from friends, being able to learn from peers. Of course, the worry is that there are plenty of other students who are not like that. They're going to be the ones who just want an answer, and they're not going to be able to benefit from this.
Yeah, and I think you highlight a different kind of challenge, which is how students are actually going to interact with these systems. And one challenge there is, exactly, there's a difference between what people say and what they do, which is why this colleague of ours who's basically installing spyware on the students, with anonymization and a promise that they won't suffer any penalties, is trying to work out how they actually use it. Because students will say, and we have declaration protocols, they'll say, yes, I used AI for ideation and grammar checking. But if you actually track what they do, Anthropic did a study of US college students where 50% of the queries were, give me the answer. You also raise a point that Gregor touched on, which is the timing problem. And this is the real difficulty for universities, that it takes years to bring about any major impact, especially with an undergraduate degree. It can take a year to get it approved, 3 or 4 years for a student to go through the system, and then the world's changed by the time they graduate. Plus, I suppose we've got the problem of academics, and Natasha, I'll come to you, because there's an old joke, I'll pick on Oxford. How many Oxford professors does it take to change a light bulb? Change? Why would we change? And so, Natasha, one of the things you've looked at is many academics see potential of AI, but feel undersupported or uncertain in their new environment. So if universities' aims, and again, Gregor touched on this, is cultivating students' critical and ethical use of AI, how should universities be changing administrative structures, curriculums, programs to ensure that we live up to that promise?
Thank you. I'll do my best in the 5 minutes I've got. It was really interesting when ChatGPT was released. I thought I'd really like to take a bit of a temperature check here at the university to see how people are using it. And in the first semester, 50% of students that responded to the survey said that they had used it. By semester 2, the response rate was up at 80%, and it's even higher now. We have other research that shows us that. In semester 1, 70% of students thought that using ChatGPT or an equivalent was cheating. That reduced to 20% in semester 2. So it was really interesting to see as more people were using it, the less they thought there was an issue with academic integrity. So I think at the very base level, we can assume that most students are using some form of generative AI to support them in their studies. Now, for our international students, they're using it for language support. Some students don't want to talk directly to a tutor or a lecturer, so they will use this technology as a study buddy. So we know that our students are using it. Staff are also using it. Staff are using it to prepare quizzes, to support with support assessment and so on. Now, in terms of university policy and where we've gone with that, we have guidelines here at the University of Melbourne, and these have been established at lots of institutions around the world. The guidelines they uses terms such as AI literacy, risk, contemporary assessments. And the contemporary assessment, I'll address some of them separately, but when we talk about contemporary assessment, so we have to change the way that we assess students in higher education. It reminds me a little bit of the discussions we were having at the turn of the century. 21st century learning, we need new skills for it's quite surface level. So we need new types of assessments. We need to focus on process rather than product. Now, that is a bit of a problem too, because we say, okay, well, how do we manage this process of assessment? I might set a 10-minute presentation as an assessment, but for that 10-minute presentation, that might work in education where there's face-to-face. What happens when they're online modules or where you've got huge cohorts? How are we going to manage this assessment process, especially when the practicalities of university and space and the time that we have with the students is really important. So I think there needs to be a fundamental shift in curriculum and assessment. I think we need to be having these conversations. Novel assessments like creating a podcast, to me it's very different to saying, okay, we need to move away from traditional assessments. A podcast is not a traditional assessment, but I inherited a subject earlier this year where I'm sure I was just hearing ChatGPT scripts being read out as a podcast. So it sounds contemporary, but it wasn't quite. We're starting to embrace AI in various assessments and curriculum. Especially in education, I think this is where it needs to start. We need to support our pre-service teachers and our in-service teachers in dealing with this, because those children that are in schools today will go to university, will pick up trades, whether it's vocational education or higher education, and they will inevitably use artificial intelligence in their work or be impacted or influenced by it. I found the comment really interesting earlier about young people looking to AI for mental health support. And I just wanted to flip that and say, well, how would you feel if you went to a psychologist and they were using AI to diagnose? And so I think in terms of universities and especially in education, we know that our COVID experience put us behind screens and there was a barrier between teachers and students. We know that that had implications for teaching and learning. I don't think people have stopped thinking, as everyone was concerned about initially. But teaching is an intensely relational profession. And we know that there are lots of things going on in young people's lives, everything from the emotional, the social, the cognitive, intellectual development that we support. What does this mean when we live in a world with AI? And I feel that rather than saying, okay, here is a two-lane sort of approach, here are the things that you can use AI for, and here are the things that you can't use AI for, are really unhelpful. I think we need to have a deeper discussion about how we can really exploit AI to help us, how we can make good decisions as humans, how we can teach students for an uncertain world. And I think the strong thing that came through this morning was really that uncertainty of where this is all going. So how do we prepare for that? And how do we ensure that we are not adopting technology in an uncritical way? How can we be critical, and how can we use it to our advantage?
Yeah, so I think that echoes nicely, but also contrasts with some of the things Loy was saying about the ability to use AI as a kind of smart friend who will challenge you. But a lot of what goes on in the classroom, and your COVID contrast, I think, highlights this, is not just the intellectual exercise. We're not just training the brain. We're not just focusing on IQ, but EQ is important. And one thing we might come back to is how in the workplace that might become more important. There's a literature about what's called the feeling economy, which is something that AI is not very good at least not yet. But in terms of universities, and Liz, I'll turn to you, education is the one we're focusing on up until now, but that's not the only thing that universities do. And AI, we touched on yesterday with the Nobel Prize for Chemistry going to work that could not have been done without AI systems. Maybe that's great in terms of protein folding, but it was also done by a for-profit corporation, Google, which is sort of calling into question the role of universities. Something I talked about yesterday also was the shift of the centre of gravity of AI research moving from publicly funded universities to for-profit corporations. You've argued that generative AI in particular will touch every part of a university and that institutions need holistic strategies rather than just piecemeal fixes. So what would an integrated AI strategy for a university look like?
It's a great question, Simon, and I would imagine, in fact I'm pretty sure, that all Australian universities and most of those across the world are looking at it institutionally, because actually you can't do it any other way. Even the basics of provision talk to you about an institutional provision rather than a segregated provision. The question really is about, well, how does the institute set the framework for working inside that space? What is it that the institution says and provides and supports that allows its people to do the best they can? And we come back again, I think, to the purpose of a university. To myself, I describe a university as an ideas ecosystem, where we've got people developing brilliant new ideas, brilliant thinking, brilliant application, and we're preparing people for an unknown future through education. And those two things are intimately linked. The people that do those two things are the same people. As Natasha was saying, the people that are teaching are also the people that are doing the research. So you need to look at it holistically. And it's very, you would miss an awfully big chance if you didn't involve your administration and your governance in that as well. If we're knowledge industries, we should apply that to everything we do. In Australia, universities are big. The average size of a university is around 35,000 students, but it goes up to 70,000, 80,000 students. They are big corporations. So they should treat major structural change like this as an institutional question. Interestingly, in Australia, we had a bit of a push start on this because our regulator, TEXA, took an active role in asking Australian universities to do something. What it actually asked for was an AI action plan, and it asked all institutions of higher education to do that. And it called them in, and it brought them together. But the really clever thing that it did was it brokered a national conversation about it. So in Australia, higher education has been talking as a sector about what to do about generative AI, and because TEXA regulates the whole university, they're talking about it in research, they're talking about it in education, and they're talking about it as a public institution. So all those aspects come together. So we can dive into particular principles, but they're the ones that you would think about. The principles that we put in place at our university, the important things about the principles were that they weren't didactic. They weren't saying, you must do this. They talked about how we would make decisions. What are our values when we deal with a pervasive, overwhelming, and extremely dynamic technology like this? So they talked about principles. But I think the thing that was most valuable, and valuable at a national level, was the discussion and the conversation. It's such a dynamic space. Today's solution is not fit for purpose tomorrow. We must work on it together and collectively. And happy to go into more detail as you choose.
Thanks so much. And I think this challenge of how universities adapt, since necessarily they're going to take time to adapt when the technology is racing ahead, is something we'll come back to. But first, I do want to come back to the bread and butter question of the employability of graduates, which is something, Jungpil, you've been working on, looking at workforce transformation and how professional pipelines are being restructured around the world. There's a discussion about an AI jobs apocalypse, the junior extinction, at least anecdotally, some companies hiring slightly fewer junior employees, raising the question that, well, you might be able to outsource some of the junior work, you only need the senior employees, but then where will senior employees come from? If universities are uncertain about the employment outcomes from their degree programs, how should we be redefining the objectives of a university, or what should we be doing to best prepare the young people who are paying us with time and money, and governments that are paying us as well, to prepare them for a world that's changing so quickly?
Yeah, it's a great question and an impossible question.
So you have 5 minutes.
I got 5 minutes to solve this impossible question. I really agree with, and I subscribe to the view that Gregor, you put forward, like what is the place of a university? That's kind of the aspirational and the philosophical kind of decision that, and kind of concept that we hold dear and near to our hearts. But the reality is that the university has kind of become a vocational pathway for employment, right? I'm not sure it's the case here in Australia, but in places like in Singapore, students choose which university to go to and which degree program to take based on this graduate employment survey that's done every year by the Ministry of Education. It lists every universities' degree programs and their median average and the 75th percentile salaries for the graduates from the previous year. And so parents who come to open house, to the universities to check out the degree program, and even the students, they look at that and they flock towards the degree programs like law, computing, just based on these very short-term feedback based on the industry needs, right? So these graduates are getting paid, $500 more, $1,000 more than graduates from this other program, and they just flock towards that. And so, somehow we've lost our, grip on what a university should be, and rather we've become kind of, industry has subsidized their entry-level training to the universities. Like in the past, when I was, way back, when I was a student, university was the place that you described. We learn, you transform and you kind of become a thinker, and you can critique and you can, think. And then you choose a company, and then you get trained for 6 months within the company, right? Now they want you to be ready and up, ready to get going on day one, which basically is in a sense the industry has subsidized its training to the universities, and for better or worse, that's kind of the situation we're in right now, right? And so I think the critical issue here is that. Yes, this novel technology called AI or Gen AI really has the capabilities, or a lot of the capabilities, that entry-level employees or workforce actually, that they're supposed to do. And so from a purely rational cost-benefit analysis perspective, it's natural for companies in industry to try to want to cut their costs, reduce the uncertainty from kind of the human workforce, increase efficiency using the technological workforce, and reshift that equilibrium. And so it's kind of a challenge you have to go through. But at the end of the day, so we can think about if that layer of capability is being taken over by a technology, what can we provide to the students who are the graduates so that they actually become more valuable or useful, needed? How do we create the demand for capabilities? Because the demand that we're currently creating is taken out by AI. And so it's really a short-term, long-term issue, as I think Loy has discussed earlier. The short-run cost-benefit is completely in favor of, replacement, technological displacement. Whereas in the long run, if you think about it, we instinctively know, and through, what we observe in how to become, how to rise up the ranks within an organization, it's that apprenticeship process the pipeline is completely shut down, right? So if you don't start at the entry level, how do you learn the tacit knowledge, the judgment skills of that sector, of that domain, because there's stickiness in the domain. There's something that you can't really learn didactically, and that you need to learn on the job. But if you don't have the entry-level experience, there's no way you can actually build that. So like in law or other kind of professional medicine, law, the entry-level tasks can be, in the short run, replaced by technology, but in the long run, you're depriving yourself of the opportunity to build the leaders of tomorrow, right? And so I think companies have yet to realize that they've cut that pipeline, and at some point they'll realize and they'll start hiring again, maybe in smaller numbers, but we're still in that kind of shift, right?
So I'll come to you in a second, Gregor. So the group of you have highlighted, I think there's a kind of economic question and a pedagogical question. The economic question is the value proposition of an undergraduate education. And it's really only from the mid-20th century onwards that the focus on employability came to dominate universities. That aspirational idea of universities has been around for centuries. What's different from the mid-20th century onwards is we have a lot more students and a lot more government money. So you could go back to a very idealistic idea of universities completely dissociated from employability, which has been around for centuries, but it tended to be a vastly smaller slice of the population that would actually get to experience that, and it was more of a kind of private benefit than seen as the public good that I think many of us would assume universities are. The pedagogical challenge is we've been treating a lot of university work as proxies for things that will be useful in employment. And the problem there is we test on output as a proxy for input. So we want students to write an essay, not because we care about the essay, but because of the work that goes into writing the essay. And the challenge ChatGPT creates is we really care if a student does something in 10 seconds versus 10 hours. Back to the employment question, I'm not sure an employer will necessarily care if you just get the output that you're after. So, Gregor, I'm curious, I mean, however you want to respond.
I was just going to respond over here, if that was okay.
Please, yeah.
So I really appreciate the graduate entry. I think that's a little bit of a wicked problem at the moment about the junior positions, and what I was saying in my opening remarks is just not quite clear how that's going to evolve. And I'm particularly interested in that expertise development that I think a couple of us have spoken about. That's certainly one to watch. My sense on the other side, when we're talking about what the value of a university is, I mean, universities in this country have always been about the professions, not, it's not about, they've always been established in this country, partly for the broadening of the individuals, but very much as a professional education organisation from the get-go. So it's not the mid-20th century, it's from inception in this country. In the Dawkins reforms in 1989, there was a fundamental change which you're sort of talking about in this country. I'm only talking about Australia, where the expansion of the system, the more vocational nature of the system, the user pays aspect of the system, so actually less money per student from the government, but more money paid into the system and an expansion of the system, which set up this dichotomy in stark terms, which is what I've spoken about before as a thinker-based education versus a worker-based education, and what you're in it for. Now, of course, you're in it for both. From the inception of universities in this country, we always want to create good thinkers, but we also want to prepare people for the workforce. And they're sometimes seen as a false dichotomy. Our education at this university, at the University of Melbourne, is a little bit different because of its broad-based undergraduate programs. We only have 6. We don't have specific vocational degrees at the undergraduate year, which sets us apart. My contention is, and I've said this before, in an era of AI, where you want people to be able to think, it's going to be more important that they've got a general understanding of the world and how to think, rather than a specific understanding of an industry, for the reasons almost that we're saying about the graduate entry programs. Now, of course, you've got to be careful about that balance, but I think that it's an interesting reflection to think about, do we want to be educating people to think in an era of AI, or try and guess what the vocations are going to be in the area of AI?
So, I mean, maybe just to push on that, I mean, one way we think about tertiary education differently from primary and secondary education is you tend not to look at a primary school and say, right, your job is to educate engineers or lawyers or whatever. It's inherently generalist, and it's about educating not just thinkers but citizens and so on. Is there a prospect that universities, or at least part of tertiary education, becomes more like that? Because one of the biggest shifts in the 20th century is the expansion of our life expectancy, but we've stuck with this model that, as you said, you have primary and secondary education, and then the idea has been, and the value proposition has been, you have 3 or 4 years at university, and then that's meant to set you on a path for a career. And that might have been the case maybe 30 years ago. People would graduate and then stick in one career. Now we know they're going to shift. We now know that many of the jobs they go into don't exist yet. So how does that change? And maybe Liz, I'll turn to you.
Yeah.
How does that change what we do at universities and how we think about our role?
So it's interesting to reflect. My university that I come from, Deakin, the majority of people enrolling are not school leavers. They're people returning to study or starting after they've been in the workforce for some time. And there are quite a number of universities in Australia that are in that state. So there are different sorts of institutions. And that follows from an idea. We've recently had a major review of higher education in Australia called the University's Accord Review, and its ambition builds on the one from the 1980s, talking about participation rates. And Australia's been slowly building its participation rate. We're up to just around 50% of 19 to 35-year-olds go to university. And the idea is that that is good for the economy. So it's an economic argument, and it was really an economic argument, I suspect, because it was pitched at government primarily, but that's fine. The idea is that the more educated people are, the more versatile they are in a dynamic environment, picking up on your point, Gregor. So the question that you're raising about returning to study and lifelong learning is a very important one, and one of the things that we need to think about as a sector and as a post-secondary sector is providing enough variety so that not every piece of learning is a 3-year degree or a 2-year postgraduate degree. And I know there's been the rise and perhaps now backgrounding of micro-credentials, dare I say that word in public anymore, but it is true that short-form learning still remains really important. So I think there's a really interesting interplay here between the acquisition of technical skills, just-in-time skills, as you're building your career, or more thoughtful and longer transformational learning through long-form learning offers and study plans. So it's a complex situation, but diversity will be king. It will be about making different choices available.
So I've got a few more questions for the panel, then we'll be opening it up. But maybe, Loy and Natasha, can I get you to address this question of what students are hoping to get out of at university? Because I think in Singapore, Loy, we're familiar with students being quite instrumental in their desire to get skills. And one question is whether that will remain structured around degrees. Because personally, I think the competitors to universities, I mean, Melbourne and NUS and Hong Kong and Chieh, we're happy competitors in one way. I actually think our competitors could be LinkedIn Learning, Google certificates, and for-profit, again, companies that are offering pathways to specific skills as employers might start not to believe the credentialing, and they're looking more for competencies, I think is a key question. So do you worry that students will become more instrumental in that way, and what, if anything, should we do to stop them? Maybe Loy and then Natasha.
Yeah, so before you became my boss, I was doing a different job for the university. So I was actually working on the employability portfolio for FASS, right? So one thing I discovered was exactly this question. And the weird thing I also discovered is that it's not really making a dent in a place like Singapore, just because there's so much inertia and conservatism among the parents. So that's one thing, and among the employers as well, right? So at the end of the day, I think people are still going to assume that if you're going to get hired by one of the better companies, you're going to have a degree, right? You're not going to have one of these micro-credentials. You might have a stack of those later on in life, though. So that is picking up as well. Yeah. But as the first entry-level position, people are going to look for you to the degree. So I don't think the competition is directly like that, though. However, the other thing that Jungpil was mentioning is going to be a real problem for us, because if companies more and more do not want to do in-house training for newcomers anymore, they are going to reduce their reliance on the entry-level positions, then it will be a problem for a big part of our undergraduate population. Not for all of them. Plenty of them are still getting hired, but somewhere along the curve, you're going to have a larger and larger spread of students who are going to find themselves facing a longer job search, more difficult job search. And this problem, ironically, is not even purely about AI, is caused by AI. In fact, I've been noticing for at least 10 to 15 years, what we're discovering is that as employment preferences of the younger generations change, we notice that many of them don't actually want to stay put in the same company for years and years, right? Which also incentivizes their own employers to not invest in their training. Because the way the employers are thinking about it is, if we invest in you, and then you're going to cross the street to our competitor who wants to pay you, why are we doing that? Why are we paying the money for your training? So there's a whole bunch of kind of vicious cycle things going on, and AI is just adding to that. AI is not even the main cause of some of these things. What we might call millennial and Gen Z employment preferences may well be one of the background issues, actually. And I do see it even in some of the young people we hire in our own shop, right? We used to imagine that we hire them, they're going to work for us for 30 years. The youngest ones we hire now, we're talking about if we can keep them for 5 years, we're good. And even that is, is biting us as well, right? So
I will sound like an old fogey, but I can't resist mentioning in one of these hiring processes, we were hiring someone, and there was a person who had 5 jobs in the last 4 years, and I asked her, well, if we hire you, how do we know you'll stay? And she said, well, if you make it interesting, I might stay. Natasha.
It's totally happening to us, right? So I don't think that I don't think it's a good idea to look at this purely from the AI perspective. It's larger trends about human preferences, people's preferences, society, labor practices, and all those things have to be in play. AI is one very important new thing, new entrant to the mix, but it's not the only thing in the mix, though.
Natasha.
And I don't agree with that. I'm sorry, my comments are going to be very specific to the context of education. I've worked here at the university for 17 years, and the one thing that hasn't changed as I work with different cohorts from year to year is that passion that our pre-service teachers bring. They want to learn. They want to make a difference in society. They've got a very strong social justice lens through which they view education. And they are genuinely passionate. Now, I'm generalising here. Not every single one is always like this, but overall, over the years, that's the key pattern I've found. They really want to address some of the issues that are in society, and I think inherently quite a few of them believe that one of the ways that we address the injustices is through education. So when you adopt that stance, or that is your worldview, coming into an education degree, you are very much focused on the next step, and almost all of our students are looking to work in schools after they complete their degrees. At the moment in Australia, so very different 20 years ago, but at the moment in Australia, there is a shortage so there are a few factors here at work. There's a shortage of teachers generally. So our graduates will get jobs in schools if they want them. Some of them don't want to. Some of them want to work part-time. They want to travel. They want to go overseas. They want to teach English in another country, and that's absolutely fine as well. But that's their motivation. In terms of AI and how that's changing it, so we've got this traditional view of working with people and the change that teachers want to bring both to themselves, their community and society more broadly. But we also have this in the contemporary context of AI that is encroaching on all aspects of our lives, personal and professional. So I'm not sure that answers your question more broadly in terms of education, but certainly in our field, I think that the primary motivations and principles in relation to, well, what is the purpose of education? And interestingly, that's one of their first assignments that they do in the course. What is the purpose of education? And it's incredibly inspiring to read their responses. So there's a lot of hope and positivity there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one reason I wanted to have you on the panel is this goes beyond just university education. There was literally an article in the Straits Times single newspaper, should a 5-year-old be using ChatGPT? Which I thought could have been a one-word story. No. But I think actually a lot of the challenge is not, by the time students get to university, they're partly formed. The real risk, I think, is secondary school. If students don't develop the capacity to think, to write, it'll be like a primary school kid who's given a calculator can do a lot of complex arithmetic until they don't have the calculator, and then they're useless. Jungpil, just on this sort of employability question, one place we've looked at is places like the Philippines, where there's a lot of reliance on business process outsourcing. And again, there's a short-term, longer-term challenge there. The short-term opportunity is they can be much more efficient. This is the kind of AI-enhanced human can do a lot more. But there's a medium and longer-term risk that employability, that just it craters, and that there is a real lack of. So I suppose the more apocalyptic question for you is, how worried are you about the job apocalypse? So not just jobs being transformed, but employability and employment rates plummeting. And if that happens, what, if anything, could universities do to better prepare students for that much more disrupted environment where perhaps jobs get broken down to tasks, careers become gigs, and we're all doing the equivalent of knowledge work for Uber or Grab?
Really did not want to get into this because I'm a very nihilistic about the future of AI. The apocalypse is coming, I feel. And a lot of as technology gets better and better, the range of things that it can do will become better, will increase, and the need for so is human work, or the dignity of human work, is that something to be protected? Is really the question, not whether or not we will win over the technology. And so it's really, again, as kind of the undercurrent of a lot of the earlier conversations as well. It is a human choice. It's a choice that we make, and is this something that we want to protect versus leave it to the forces of economic supply and demand, pricing and all that, and costing, such that, yes, the obvious answer is, yes, let's outsource it to technology. And the humans are on the losing side of this battle. And so it's really kind of a choice that we need to make. and seriously consider and choose. And so that's where, when the economic forces are destined for market failure or some kind of failure, that's where regulation is required. Right? And so I think that's how we should be thinking about the problem, and not just where's the new equilibrium given a huge reduction in cost and capabilities, and what companies, if left to their own devices, how they would find a new equilibrium is really in a future where people don't have opportunities for that, for working and contributing meaningfully to society. And so I think that's kind of paradigm shift that we really need to be thinking about at this point.
So one last question, Gregor, for you before I open it up, which is there's an old sort of hockey idea from Wayne Gretzky that you skate to where the puck is rather than where it is now. The problem for universities is when we change an educational program, it takes years to see the outcome. So how do you think about the sequencing of this? When there are so many unknown unknowns, how do we best prepare students for an environment where we have no idea, really, where Dario Amodei is saying at Anthropic, 50% of white-collar jobs are going to disappear. Others are saying that's completely an overreaction. Others, like Stuart Russell this morning, were saying, well, we could all be dead anyway, so I suppose there's that to look forward to. Well, at the same time, people like Keynes, almost 100 years ago, were saying, this would be great. We'll have a 15-hour work week. Life will be much more about the aspirational qualities that we could cultivate at universities. So in that environment of uncertainty, how do you think about policies where you'll only see the impact at best 3 or 4 years when students graduate, or realistically a decade or two in the future where you see whether the education that you've offered has actually impacted their lives in a positive way?
Yeah, again, an impossible question, but a really useful one to think about. I think there's a couple of ways, and it goes back to my starting comments, a couple of ways to think about that, a couple of tiers to think about that. One is in the area of curriculum and programs. So actually what you offer, we talked about short courses, we talked about the ways in which curriculum changes and the speed of that change. I think most universities are now thinking, and we're hoping to run a symposium next year on this, thinking about how they need to change curriculum, either through new courses or the way in which you embed kind of AI kind of things into programs. I think that's one answer to the question, which is trying to set you up as quickly as possible for graduates who are going to complete their studies and move on. The second area is about the student, which is about skills and knowledge, and I'm sort of going to lean on the things that I've said before. My perspective on this is that you will be best served by avoiding the idea of thinking that you need to be more specific and more focused on AI and technology and technical skills. I think foundational skills in terms of knowledge and skills that were referred to before, 21st century skills, but what we all refer to as analytical skills, thinking skills, human skills, and making sure that there's a fair dose of that in curriculum is the way in which I would go on how we're preparing our students for the future. And the final thing that I'll say, which we sometimes just sidestep ever so slightly, because we might think about a Bachelor of Arts degree or a Bachelor of Science degree, but many of the programs that we offer in the university are not just regulated, but they're accredited. And they're accredited for a good reason, because we want teachers and nurses and engineers and whomever to have some sort of recognition by an authority, which is not Google and not Ericsson and not KPMG, that they pass muster in terms of professional practice. I'm not sure that's going anywhere soon. And the last thing I'll say, Simon, is I'm always reminded, I've been in the EdTech game for close to 3 decades. If you look at some of the commentary about Google and Wikipedia, or let's say MOOCs, much of the commentary we're seeing at the moment is very, very similar. Now, I'm more on I think there's something going on here, probably not as nihilistic, but there is something a little bit going on here that is different. But it is good to remind ourselves that we do go through this cycle quite regularly of the death of the university and the value of education, which is fostered by a technocentric view of the world.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions, very, very brief comments. Please.